Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening as we wrap up chapters 11 and 12 of Follow the Flock. How's it going, Tom? Nice to see you.
Hi, going great.
Glad to see
Yeah,
you this evening.
this
Sort
is
of
sort of a strange thing with you being in Colorado and I'm here in the dining room. So,
Yeah, it's a unique sort of format for us here, but we're going to wait a couple minutes for folks to log on and we're going to start our discussions very shortly. Hello, Marie. Nice to see you tuning in from Thurmont.
hi, Marie.
All right, we're going to give folks just another minute to get started. Hold tight, everybody. Here we got some folks tuning in from all over the place. We got some Maryland people. Nice to see you all. Sir Tom, let's talk a little bit about the last two chapters that we're covering here, the 11 and 12, not our last two. We still have another week to go.
Well, I love the way they have named some of the chapters. First of all, of ghost ships, green cheese, and get off my land.
Yeah,
The ghost ships. I mean, we open it up right away and find out all about the Black Plague.
yeah,
Uh,
which I was sort of wondering how the author was going to tie that into sheep and how they've sort of shaped our civilization. Were you
yeah.
surprised at some of the facts you learned in the chapter?
Oh my gosh, yes. And as I read this, I couldn't help but relate it to our COVID situation and how so
Great.
many people around the world are dying from COVID. And it's the same sort of thing. It's like, oh my gosh, the Black Death.
Yeah,
Um,
agreed.
how many
Agreed.
people died from that?
Yeah.
But also what it did to the economy and how the people who did live through that and survive, how all of a sudden they were able to make a little extra money
Yeah.
because of raising sheep and things like
That's
that. Yeah, I
exactly
mean,
right. There's sort of this domino effect, a cause and effect of things that happen to civilizations and how they react to it. I've kind of found the discussions really intriguing, and I felt like it was worthwhile doing some continuing exploration of it. And I did find a nice website for you all to explore on the facts and history of the Black Death. And this website is very much on point with Sally, our author, and how it started. Now, one of the things that I did notice that sort of varied from what Sally's discussion about the ship that showed up in Norway, and all of
right.
the members or all the people on the ship had actually been expired, sort of spreading it very quickly in that region. There's also other accounts in other port cities, including one that had 12 ships come into port and almost everyone was dead or sick. Those 12 ships were a super spreader in that area, and that was in a Sicilian port. So we're talking about Norway, Sicily, ports in France were experiencing it, but most of them, there was no way to stop it. It was highly contagious, and
Hmm.
without sort of our modern understanding of germs and how disease is passed from one to another, you could see how it became very rampant. Yeah.
Did you also get the feeling like when you have like an uprising or a riot in a big city and all of a
Mhm.
sudden people are just breaking windows and going into stores and looting? It
Yeah.
made me sort of think about like, well, it's too bad for all these people that died on the ship, but hey,
Yeah.
there's all this wool. I'm
Yeah.
going to just take the wool, and they
Sure.
looted the ships.
Yeah, loot the ships and take the goods. Now, the other thing that really surprised me, and I have another website that Deb is going to share in the chat section, of how the plague not only affected humans but also livestock as well. Unlike the coronavirus, which we're all familiar with, the Black Plague did not discriminate between species, and so whole herds of cows, pigs, sheep, they were all affected, and they would be
Hmm.
thrown on dumps. They didn't have the knowledge to know that the animal died and they shouldn't consume it later, and so then people became infected as well.
Yeah.
And that's sort of like a vicious cycle when there's no understanding of how it's being passed from one to the other. But definitely, Sally is in sort of agreement with a lot of other sources that once it had sort of passed through, is sort of more of like a 5 year period, um,
Hmm.
at least this first round, because when you look at the facts, the Black Plague has continued to resurface throughout history many times over in areas, and there are still accounts even in our modern day. I think there's up to like 1,000 cases of that form that we can still find. It's never been completely eradicated, which is sort of scary, but at the same time,
Yeah.
modern mitigations make it so that it's not such a big problem.
Yeah, we don't have to worry so much about that.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that was sort of a cause and effect of that is some legislation being put in place. I'm thinking specifically the one in 1351. This is when they started saying, hey, we know there's not a lot of people anymore, but that doesn't mean the ones remaining get to just sort of go wherever they want and ask for whatever wages. They started capping wages. Um, because you can think about it, in some cities, like she said, where it was reduced down to maybe like 20% of the original population, any able-bodied hands could basically say, well, so and so over here is asking or will offer me this price. Can you do any better? And economically, they weren't doing as much work because they didn't have as many people, and they were asking for higher wages. And you can see how probably the thought process behind that is this is going to help us and save us, but it became a really, really big economic problem.
It did, and wasn't it fascinating how um, the, let's say, the aristocracy who were finely dressed,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden they're going, well, these people are getting a little uppity.
Yeah.
We got to
Yeah.
keep them
We have to
basically in
keep the
sackcloth.
classes divided. Yeah, let's keep these people in their place. And some of the things that had been done for centuries, like the open land, where people had access to land to farm it and use it, and there were things put in place where you get a little bit of good land and a little bit of bad land to sort of
Oh
average
yeah.
it all out. Most of that was done away with, and people were forced off lands. They started putting up things like stone walls for the privatization of their land. And what I love about this particular image is that you can see that these stone walls, I'm sure that a person who is much more knowledgeable could date the construction of this wall, but sprinkled all throughout the United Kingdom, you will see similar images to this. And you can see this is a modern day shepherd on their ATV, and they're still using that same stone wall structure that were laid all those hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wonder, you wonder about how old that is, and if those stones could talk, and
Yeah.
the amount of sheep that they've seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was interesting to see that in the beginning, it seems like some of the population were actually okay. They were on board with it. They were actually helping to, set the walls until they realized what was happening. This privatization was really dramatic. And England is not the only place where this started occurring. And we have to sort of keep that in mind. Yeah. Now, in this whole movement, it wasn't an overnight thing, this privatization of land. It was actually more of like a 300-year span until basically the entire country had been privatized. And so that trickle effect, I'm sure there was lots of upheavals, there were pushbacks. And we probably have the most amount of knowledge about the Highland clearances. There's been a lot
Mhm.
of romanticized storytelling with literature as well as cinematography. But the Highland clearances were a really, really serious happening. And I have a web page that gives you a little bit more understanding of um, how that process happened and how they actually cleared them off the land. It was very much to my surprise some of the stories that I had never heard, including the fact that some of the landlords were willing to even pay for people to immigrate to other countries. Like, we don't even want you here. Like, we can't even put you in town. We'd rather send
No.
you to Australia than support you any longer. And that in itself, I think, is really hard to get your head wrapped around. Coming from the background where people had an opportunity to um, use the land freely, right? As long as
Right.
they were in servitude to their landlords. Yeah.
You know, Sarah, what really struck me about Sally's chapter here was
Mhm.
also, um, these people were invited to like a public meeting,
Yeah,
and while they were there, all of a sudden they were just rounds up, and some of them who objected to it, I mean, they were handcuffed and thrown onto ships.
yeah,
I can
yeah,
imagine, the organization of bringing all those ships into a harbor and then throwing people onto these ships and saying,
yeah.
"Adios, farewell," and we're
Yeah.
sending you off to Nova Scotia.
Yeah. So
My
Becca just put in the comments, so she said, basically that's how my ancestors got here with those sort of events. You know what? I think there's
wow,
lots of stories to be told, and sometimes the extreme stories are the ones that stick in our mind. However, I'm sure there were many instances where somebody thought, hey, this awful thing is happening here. If my landlord is willing to pay my way to Australia where I can start a new beginning and possibly obtain my own land, maybe this
yeah,
is not such a bad thing. And I found a website on the history of Nova Scotia that Deb will link for you in the chat section. I found this to be really interesting because Nova Scotia is a very small place, but if you ever have a chance to visit as well as Prince Edward Island, you can really feel the influence of the Scottish culture. And in this particular website, they go over just all of the situations that we're discussing, but in more detail. So if you're really excited or you're intrigued about what that really looked like, go ahead and navigate over to that page and read a little bit more. Yeah. Have you ever been to Nova Scotia? I never asked you that.
No, I've never been to Nova Scotia, but I've heard about this wonderful folk school where you can go up and you can take classes in drumming,
Mm.
in learning how to play a bagpipe. I think it's a little bit like J.C. Campbell
Oh, yeah.
uh, folk school, but it's in Nova Scotia, and I can remember talking to people about it and said it was a wonderful experience.
Interesting. Do you
So
know what it was called?
I don't
Would it be
know.
called the Life School, perhaps?
I don't know,
I
but it
don't
certainly sounds like a fun place to
We'll
go.
do a little bit more research and see if we can find more on that because that does sound really fun. But when you go to those type of places and you look at the stylization of the homes and you look at the type of jobs that they focused on, it screams the Highlands, honestly. And the color usage of painting their houses to the fishing communities, it's really deeply steeped. Yeah.
Well, they brought with them what they knew and just reproduced it again in another country.
That's exactly right. And if you look at the
Yeah.
names of the towns, of course, Nova Scotia really means New Scotland. That's really
Oh,
what it means. And so aptly termed, I believe. Yeah.
yeah.
So, we go through these chapters and basically the entire country has been redesigned. And, I'm thinking about the logistics of the population. We've had major reductions in population because of disease. Now we're
Right.
having population has increased again, but they've decided that the land is much more profitable for them raising sheep than hosting all these people. So let's just clear them out, right? And when you look at some of these areas that they're talking about, it's much easier for me to imagine a sheep grazing in that environment than tilling it up and planting, especially like areas like the Aran Islands.
Oh, yeah.
It's really difficult to think of any sort of agriculture going on there besides grazing animals. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more now that let's get into the fun stuff, the stuff that we like to talk about, which is fiber.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the clothing for me in chapter 12 was far more interesting. And the first thing we start talking about are these Gansey sweaters. And you and I, we're pretty traditional in our dress. But what I love about these is you start looking into the deep history behind these sweaters and sort of symbology around the stitches that are made. And it's kind of fun to imagine how these were developed. And there can be discussions of like all this symbology behind each stitch, but I feel like it's probably more along the lines of one person came up with a really great design. It was very practical. Let's make a modification here and a modification there. And what ended up happening is a bunch of sailors came back and said, we love this one, make 10 more. And it became sort of the set standard among the people there.
Sure. And the whole visual, and people want that. And so, yeah,
Exactly right. Yeah. And we're still making them today. This is a great example of a Gansey sweater that you can get the pattern and knit yourself. There's also, if you're a knitter and you're interested, I'm going to have Deb put in the chat section a link to a web page called Gansey Nation. I found this website to be so fun to poke around in because they give a little bit of back history, but they also give you an idea of the preparation, what your typical set should be, which on these sweaters is using a much smaller needle than what you might do to gauge typically. And they're using, like fingering weight yarn. It's a time consuming sweater to knit. But they also go into a lot of detail in the construction. And I think that with the Gansey sweater, it has some really neat anatomical things about it that you might not really think about. For instance, the historic photos really show the shortening of the sleeves and the width. In the book, they talked about how that was really practical in bringing in ropes. You don't want a lot of extra getting in the
that's
way.
exactly right, around their wrists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, this is something I wanted to talk to you about because you and I both do natural dyeing. And in the book, there was reference to the fact that these Gansey sweaters, traditionally, they would not wash the wool ahead of time before they spun
Hmm.
it. And then they would indigo dye it. What did you think about that? Do you think that was
Um,
historically accurate?
no, I don't,
Yeah, I don't
because I
think
have
so either.
dyed an awful lot of yarn in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And the whole idea about leaving the natural lanolin in there, first of all, it repels dye.
Hmm.
So, and then she talked about using woad,
Right.
and woad does dye blue,
Yes.
but you need like 20 times more than you would with indigo.
Right.
So first of all, you've got the repellent of the lanolin and the dirty wool.
Hmm.
And I shouldn't say dirty wool, but you've got the lanolin in
It
there,
is
and
dirty
then
though. If
you've
it's
got
not washed, it
uh,
means that you're covered in urine and straw and whatever
yeah,
else it picked up. Yeah.
because it's supposedly water repellent at that point.
Mhm.
When you've got something that's that filthy, and then
Mhm.
you're trying to dye it with a dye material that takes much, much more than you would for indigo,
Yeah.
I think it just sets up in my mind like I got to try this because
Yeah.
I don't believe it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't mean to pick apart details, but just with personal experience, it just didn't ring true to me. The other
No,
thing is that in the previous chapters we were discussing that for hundreds of years we've known how to extract lanolin and use it as a secondary product. I mean, that was what
right.
we discussed last week. And so it makes far more sense to me that they might re waterproof it later. But let's face it, you wear it a couple times and you wash it the first. Yeah. So
It's
I just wanted to sort of point out that little bit of detail that I had a problem with.
I did too, and but I'm glad she said, take that old wives' tale about the fisherman fell overboard and was washed ashore, and we were able to identify him by the stitches in his sweater.
Yeah.
That was lovingly done because it's just that family on the
Yeah.
island that only made that sweater.
That's
I'm glad
exactly
she
right.
sort of debunked that.
And I think that's really hard too. And I'll sort of like put this in your court as well. These are some pictures of Aaron's sweaters. This was the next step. And this is a perfect example, even in modern applications, of the cabling effect that were highly influenced by the Celts. They've had imagery like this for hundreds of years. And you can really see in these line drawings how those relate to the cabled effects.
Oh yeah.
And so when they talk about them having cultural significance and they give them things like the tree of life or wandering vines, that makes a lot more sense to me because they're using visuals for visuals. The idea that you can identify a body is sort of far-fetched. I mean, what's the likelihood of somebody actually washing back up on shore? Maybe a few every once in a while, but I don't think that was the main reason.
I don't either.
So, but that's okay. Things get passed down. We make inferences from what we know, and it's kind of nice to pass down romanticized ideas, I think, a little bit. Yeah. So, in addition to those Aran sweaters that we're looking at, another sort of culture that we need to look at a little bit closer are the Icelandic people. I thought it was
Hmm.
really interesting when they started bringing up some of these beautiful Icelandic sweaters. And after working in a yarn store for a while, these patterns are still being made today. If anybody's
Oh
a
yeah.
slopey sweater, put a picture of it in the chat box for us so we can see what it looks like. But the design of it has influences from Denmark, certainly, but it also has its own cultural identity in the fact that it almost happened simultaneously when they separated from Denmark. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I did not know that, but I look at all those Icelandic sweaters and I see those
Yeah.
patterns, and it reminds me an awful lot as a rug weaver, the crock broad patterns or the
Yeah.
bound woven patterns. You can
Yes.
almost see, the relationship between them.
That's exactly right. Yeah, Brenda just put down the chat box that they are super warm, and I can attest to that. One of the things that I love about continued research is you get sort of insider perspective of people who actually live in those places. And Deb has a great website to share with you in the chat box just about these Icelandic Lopapisa. We were talking about this before we went on. Excuse the pronunciation, but there's some lot of really good information on this website that I hope you all feel good to go and explore. Um, I also wanted to highlight a lot of these Icelandic sweaters are using a yarn similar to this commercial Lopi yarn. I
Mhm.
have used this yarn many times and it comes in a lighter and a heavier weight. But the common theme with it tends to be that it's a single ply, very lofty yarn. Would you agree, Dad?
You know what? I've actually taken it apart, and it's actually a very softly plied two-ply thread.
Oh,
So if you
really?
take a length of it and you pull it apart, it's
Uh,
almost as if they've taken, for all you spinners,
yeah.
what they call a pencil roving, and
Oh,
just
yeah.
put two strands together with the softest twist in there, just enough to hold it together.
Yeah. Now, the first image that I showed you, I'll bring that back up on screen because I think this is kind of it echoes to maybe the beginnings of this. These two images here, I specifically chose compared to others because they're all utilizing variations on grays, browns, and naturals.
Mhm.
And the thing to remember about the significance within their culture is the sheep that they were raising came in many different varieties of colors from white to dark brown. And so, just like we do with Jacob sheep, sometimes we'll separate out the dark parts and the
Oh
light parts. And right here, they would have a whole color palette of all different shades from natural to dark brown. And it must have been inspirational to say, well, how can we design something fun utilizing all these colors? Um, if anybody has more information that they can put in the chat box, I wasn't able to find a lot of information about the natural dyeing practices in Iceland, but looking at the environment there, I wonder what natural dye plants would have been available to them that they stuck to using the natural colors from the sheep. So if anybody has more information on that subject, please share it with the rest of the folks in our chat box, okay?
you know, I'm just sort of guessing that there's an awful lot of dyes extracted from the lichens and
Yeah.
also um, from mushrooms.
Oh,
Um,
good point. Good point.
so,
And you know what? A lot of those folks brought traditions from Scandinavia, specifically
mhm.
Denmark. And so they would have had some of that. Um, but trading would have been difficult. I can't imagine there was a whole lot of trade ships coming out to Iceland to bring things like woad.
Right.
However, I hate to speak too much on it without knowing the plants that naturally grow there. They may have their own versions of goldenrod or madder root.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, let's see. There is a suggestion for us here. There's a resource who lives in Iceland and she's on Facebook. So we'll have to look her up and see if she can give us a little bit more information on this
Oh, that
subject.
would be fun.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy, so much for including that. This is why I love this format so much. Appreciate it. Yeah. Now, lastly, and this could be a big discussion for us. In fact, we could have an entire day talking about construction and tartans.
Oh, yeah.
We should have called Melissa up and said, hey, let's talk about tartans at a different point because she knows a lot on the subject. But I do love the fact, and I hate the fact, because Scotland usually gets all the credit for tartans. We're now finding that might not be the case.
I can remember, Sarah, years ago, Melissa talking about these two brothers that created this stigma, about Scottish
Excuse me.
Tartans, and they invented the whole thing with the book, and then that they found, and yet nobody's ever seen this book.
Yeah,
But oh yeah, we have all these Scottish Tartans and
yeah,
down. And
yeah.
I did want to
However,
bring up,
I mean, it was bad because
yeah.
they started a whole series of stories about each clan having their own identification. And remember, there's probably a lot lost over time, especially when with all these people being thrown out of the Highlands, and then they were totally banned for a while, which is
Yep.
terrible in itself. So culturally, I think they probably became separated because that 50-year period where nobody could wear them, that means almost two generations of people had no opportunity to celebrate and have like identity. But that story is also kind of wonderful too. Because it gives that romantic edge, and I think that the public wanted to believe it. And
Oh, I think they grasped that,
yeah, yeah,
and they
I'm
just
glad
loved
that
it.
Jan threw in the chat section for us down here too that on top of everything, they weren't even Scottish; they were English.
Yeah. From Wales.
Right? Yeah. So I mean, people wanted to believe that story, and so even afterwards, and they were kicked back, they still tried to keep pushing the story and try to make it a real thing. But today we have an opportunity to look at tartans completely different. Again, here's a website that I think you all should have an opportunity to check out through the Scottish Tartan Authority. And this website gives a lot of really great information. It also goes into the birth and the growth of tartans, goes into the Jacobites, the Act of Proscription. So if you're a real history nut, there's a lot of good information on here. I also want to bring to your attention the official Scottish Registry of Tartans. And if no one has ever navigated to this page before, again, there's lots of cool stuff on here, but you can register your own tartan. In fact, I looked up for our trip to Scotland what the registered tartan for the national soccer team was. You can also look for something. And I'm going to throw one in here. I know that there's a lot of the Stewart Tartan. And the
Mhm.
Stewart Tartan, if you're not familiar with it, is probably most recognizably identified by this guy right here. In fact, I attended Edinburgh University up on Lake Erie in Pennsylvania, and this was the tartan that they flew to represent our entire university. Now, the thing about the Stewart tartan, which is neat, is that any person who claims Scottish heritage can claim the Stewart tartan. So if you don't know you're from a specific clan, you can wear Stewart and it's okay. But once
That's
people
funny.
were able to, oh, you know what? Let me go back over to the web because now that the Stewart has come up, I want to show you this. Stewart is not Stewart is not Stewart. And you'll find that within families, there's lots of different variation. This one is the 18th century version, the Castle Stewart, the Glen Stewart. And so when a family claims something, it will go into this official registry and you can look it up. If you are a registered user of this website, you can actually click on a specific tartan. I'm just going to click one so that you can see. I'm getting click happy here. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see that if you log in, you can actually get a thread count. So as a weaver, you can reproduce any of the tartans that are listed on this official registry. If you're really good, you can just blow it up and start counting on the screen, but it's nice to have an official draw down to follow. And kind of as a reminder, the nice thing is as long as you have the thread count, all tartans are woven trampes writ. So whatever your threading order was for your warp, you just repeat it in the left way direction and you've perfectly made your plaid.
Sarah, I have to say I'm a little disappointed as a weaver, and maybe you felt the same thing, that she did not include some of the other criteria. Just as you mentioned, whatever the color arrangement is in the warp, you're putting it
Yeah,
also Trump as written in the weft.
yeah.
Um, and also being woven as a tutu twill. But you and I would find that's a really important fact that might have been included. But you have to remember that Sally was not writing this book for weavers per
Weavers.
se.
Yes, that is good,
Um,
important to remember. Yeah.
but I did come up with my own tartan for our grandson and your nephew
Yes.
Bodie,
Yes.
and it was just colors of national flags of our heritage all put together.
Yeah.
So it's a whole lot of fun, and folks, you can do the same thing. Put the
Absolutely.
colors that you like together,
Yeah.
uh, and come up with your own tartan. And if it's you could register it, as Sarah said.
Absolutely. Yep. So, and I don't know what the credentials are to actually register a tartan. I'm sure that there's more than like, hey, I made this up. But Dee put a nice comment up to remind us that some clans, if they were super small, might fall under a larger clan. And we see that sometimes documented in even cinematography, where the larger clan may be a protector of several smaller clans. And so it makes sense that they could wear the same stuff. Yeah. Yeah, and you know what? I think that when it comes to tartans, we see it move all the way through Scandinavia. I love that they found some archaeological evidence of a gentleman wearing plaid even in Asia, but fortunately we found them in such modern times that they can do DNA research to find out it was actually a European. It would be fun to know the story of how he made it so far from home.
Well, I just wanted to comment a little bit on that, and I'm sure some of our viewers here tonight will say, "Oh yeah, I've read that book too."
Yeah.
Supposedly, this mummy has fiery red hair still intact and is almost 7 foot tall.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
7 foot
clearly, he's
tall.
not Mongolian, right?
No,
But
excuse me.
yeah, the book, "The Mummies of Uramchi,"
Yes.
uh, is what brought that up to light.
Yeah.
And so, folks, we have a copy of it in the library at Redstone Glen. So if you're passing by and you're interested in it, come take a look at the library. We can show it
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah. Dee, you're putting some awesome comments in the box today. Thank you for participating. She's also saying that so much of the Scottish culture is also Viking related because remember in previous chapters we were talking about with the growth of some of their flocks as well as expanding their territories, a lot of the Viking culture integrated into some of those Celtic regions. And of course, they're going to share ideas. And
Sure.
I don't think it's too far fetched, especially as a weaver, to sort of say, oh, I know how to make a striped warp. What would happen if I repeat the same thing in the weft? Getting to the
Right.
point of a tartan, regardless of what culture you live in, would probably be an easy A to B spring point. Yeah.
Sure. So
But
it was happening way before the Allen brothers found this mysterious book.
that's exactly right. Now, I have a couple more slides I just want to share with you. The one thing that I do love that once clan tartans were allowed to be worn again, it was nice that they had support by the monarchy. And this is a picture of Queen Victoria clad in a swath of tartan over her shoulder. And this is actually an example of one of her dresses that she would have worn, or a reproduction of one of her dresses. But with that and her fascination, she decided to cloud the entire Balmore Castle, and this is the registered tartan that they would have decorated the castle with.
Oh my gosh, isn't that a pretty tartan
It
though?
is. It's
Yeah.
very classic. I was able to find a picture of the royal family in modern day, and in both of these pictures, I think that there are examples of that Balmore Castle tartan being worn by Prince Charles, and perhaps is that Prince Philip in the back? Um,
Uh, yeah.
yeah,
The
I
view
have.
I have, the heads are cut off, but yeah, I would
Oh,
say that is the moral
okay. So,
tartan.
but yeah, I would say that they're still wearing that to this day, and I think that that's just a really awesome thing to see that Queen Victoria sort of popularized it, and it has been in popularity since, and I don't see it slowing down. We see lots of examples on the runway nowadays where tartans are used, and oh, there you go. You
Come
see
on, Mr. Plaid Man.
Mr. Plaid. There you go. Yeah. So I think with these chapters, we really see how in all three examples or four examples we talked about this evening, all have sheep in common, right? Without sheep, none of these fabrics would have been produced. And the wool, especially in regards to the sweaters, the Aran, the Ganzi, and the Icelandic, the sheep's wool was just the perfect material for its intended purpose, and it stuck in popularity as well as in practicality. Yeah. And it's nice to know that it eventually sort of trickled in other cultures embraced it as well.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, we have two more chapters left to
Yeah.
go, chapter 13 and 14. And I want to sort of bring to light before we close up that this has sort of been a special edition of our book club because we're finishing up so close to the American Thanksgiving celebration that I thought we would do something special. I don't know if many of you knew this in the write up, but we've tried to sort of let it known that with all of the purchases of these books, we're going to use the profits to buy for the holiday season some sheep from Heifer International. It's a really wonderful organization that puts in the hands of needy people livestock so that they can have wonderful lifestyles, right? And the gift of livestock is so special because of the fact that it continues to grow if it's taken care of. And in the case of sheep, they choose specific breeds that are meant to live in the environment. We're not sending merinos to Africa. So, and in most cases, they're going to be dual purpose. So it's going to provide not only meat, but milk and fiber, and hopefully a start or push a breeding program that they continue to grow this. So we want to say a special thank you so that we could make this available for somebody.
Yes, thank you, everybody. That's important. Heifer International is something that has only come into my life, well, and actually not that long ago, but it is fun to be able to send somebody a Christmas card and saying, hey, you're getting 12 chickens. Now, not you personally, but there's a family somewhere in the world who's going to be getting a dozen chickens
That's
because
right.
of
And
Heifer International.
yeah, and we are also fortunate to be in a financial situation where we don't have to think about like where our next meals are coming from or how we're going to make sure that there's something tillable for the next harvest. And so in addition to you guys purchasing the book, please feel free to check out their website. It's a nice gift idea for people who have everything already, which is most of us. Most of us are downsizing or trying to minimize what's in our life. Why not give it on to somebody else, right?
That's exactly right. Sarah,
Yeah.
you can give me a pig for Christmas. I would
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. So I have just loved this book club so much, and it was a nice way to tie in because sheep have shaped our civilization. We're learning this every chapter that we flip through. So let's give a sheep or two to some other people. Um, let's talk about
Exactly.
next week, okay? So next week we've got chapters 13 and 14, and I'm sorry, this is November 17th. We're going to be talking about mills and boom, as well as chapter 14, Up, Up, and Away, Bad Science and Sex. I do have in here for anybody who watches this broadcast and there happens to be littles in the audience. This might be our only discussion that is more PG rated, I would say, for chapter 14. So we wanted to give you guys a little bit of heads up in case. We never like to throw this sort of surprises out if you don't have a child that is ready for that level of content. So, I think that this has been a good 2 chapters. Thank you all for being so patient with our format of us being in 2 different states tonight. But I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week.
Well, Sarah, hands up to you and a big applause for being able to do this link like this. It
Oh,
blows my mind
yeah,
that we can do this
yeah.
from, halfway across the country. So
Yes,
good
I
job.
appreciate it, but this was a rare opportunity. I was happy to come out and help the folks out at Handwoven Magazine help relaunch their video productions. So for those of you who have been avid consumers of Handwoven videos in the past, We're starting that process again. And so there'll be two more rigid heddle videos coming out, one by Christmas and one hopefully in January, for especially rigid heddle folks, where I'm teaching them about color and weave effects as well as huck structures on the rigid heddle. So I got to see their new production studio and visit with new staff members that they have now that Long Thread Media has sort of rebranded Handwoven. So yeah, it's been a great opportunity. Mhm.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm proud of you, honey.
Thank you so much. I'll see you. I'll see you in a day or two.
Okay. Take care. Goodbye, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful meeting with you all.